Hey, good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? It's good to see some familiar faces out there. It is 5 o'clock on Friday here in San Francisco at the New West Summit 5, and we're happy to be talking to you about the global cannabis supply chain. My name is Bob Hoban, the founder and president of the Hoban Law Group, and my partner in crime, so to speak, is Charles Feldman, principal of Feldmann Nagel, a firm based in Denver, but offices in many places around the U.S. and has been working in the cannabis industry for many years. So proud to be working with Charles. And Charles and I are more than just colleagues as attorneys. We are business partners in a company called Gateway Proven Strategies, GPS. You may have seen some of the flyers that have gone around. GPS has merged with Green Sky Strategies, Jim McAlpine's company, and Brian Quigley. So we're working together to provide services that are more consulting based. Not just legal services, so people can understand the potential entry point to the industry, et cetera. And that's kind of what we're going to base this discussion on today. One other thing I would note, because we're running up against a hard stop for us at 6 o'clock, if you have a question, please just raise your hand, and we'll try to work it in the context of what we're talking about. So, global supply chain, Charles, what do we know? What do we need to know? We talked last week in New York about this sort of fact or fiction notion. Is there such a thing as a global cannabis supply chain? And some people just vehemently say, no, it's not a supply chain yet. It doesn't exist right now. It needs time to evolve. And other people are saying, no, I see it one step at a time, one deal at a time, that it does exist. Is the global supply chain a thing right now?
Absolutely. I think you can look at the cannabis global supply chain much like I would describe the Wizard of Oz. And much of the industry can be shaped into something that very clearly has a yellow brick road. It's a very clear road. You know where you're going. You know this is forward and that's backwards. I also see the wicked witches and the good witches. And then you end up at sort of this curtain. And we've talked a little bit about how do you understand the mystery of how this industry on a global scale is really operating? How does the look behind the curtain go? And I think we've been in the last 20 years between the two of us really focused on helping clients, helping new participants into this industry figure out what that mystery looks like. So I would say global supply chain is absolutely a real thing. If there's a question about it, it's more coming from a position of maybe a lack of context, of really truly understanding what is going on with this magnificent industry on a global scale. And I know for me, the first time I got out there, got outside of our own, we all have our own bubbles. And when you really get outside of that bubble, I know you've been all over the world speaking, organizing and guiding governments in this process, you really see how big this industry really is and where it's going.
And you might sit here in a room and say, listen, I'm in California. I'm working my butt off just to get a license for X or Y or Z. What does this global cannabis thing have to do with me? It does have something to do with you, because you have to understand the context in which you are situated. You have to understand what part of the wheel you are a cog. You have to understand that, because it's how you position yourself, which ultimately puts your company in a position or a lack of position to be acquired, to have investment, to understand what you are to somebody else. That's the context that Charles was talking about. And it does exist right now. Quite literally, we work on deals where we're building supply chain transactions from Colombia, for example, into the European Union. But this is another one, sort of this fact or fiction notion. You see press releases, but Latin America is not supplying the rest of the world right now. This is not a thing that's really happening. It will happen, and there's been test shipments that have come out of places like Colombia, from the same party on both ends, by the way.
But why did everyone rush down to Colombia for these THC licenses? Where's all that going?
Yeah, well, they rushed to Colombia, seeing Colombia being the second largest country by population in South America, and they looked at it with its large number of trade agreements, and they said, this is a free country, second largest, longest standing democracy in the Western Hemisphere, and let's go get a license down there. And the Canadians at that point in time, when they did have money, and this is a funny thing, a little story I'll tell you is, I was at a conference in Bogota a few weeks ago, and the Colombian licensees walk around, and what do they most want? It's like a girl at a middle school dance who wants the boy who's too shy to look her in the eye to ask her to dance, and the Canadians are the boys who, they're not shy though, they still act like they have money left, and the Colombians don't know that the Canadians don't have any money left. And it's this funny dance that transpires until they realize that they should just use their own sources and work on their own. But that was what it was. It was a fix and flip scenario. The Canadians came in, North American dollars came in, they spent X number of dollars, and they turn around and flip that license for millions and millions of dollars, and the Canadians overpaid because of the overvaluation in the public markets. So we saw that, and not that the Canadians don't have any money left, because that, of course, is an overstatement and an incorrect statement. But the market, in terms of valuation and spending, has shrunk. It's focused less on gobbling up real estate and assets and focused on revenues now. So how should the rest of the world view Canadians or Canadian-based companies accessing capital in the public markets? Is it the savior that the Colombians thought it was and hope it to be, or is it something else?
Well, I mean, you talk about even the title of what we're talking about, a dose of reality. So I think the rest of the world has seen this dose of reality come out of Canada, the valuations last year, the non-earnings, where the stocks are today and this year. So the rest of the world is paying attention to that. They don't want to be another one of those particular marketplaces. So how you navigate that, I go back to revenues are real. So if you don't have a business plan and a focus that's really about generating what most companies are about, actual revenues, that's going to be very difficult on the global scale, because there is now that very hard perception of how do you generate actual and real revenues. I come from my background, I come from a very a military background. I did almost 2 tours with the DEA. I was a DEA task force commander. And now bringing that sort of expertise as Bob's partner for clients in understanding that big world picture, really how does this all fit together? And it's a mystery. I've heard Bob say that before. It truly is a mystery, and navigating it and putting it together and understanding that in whatever your vertical may be, it's hard to do. It is not easy to do.
We talked a little bit about Latin America, Colombia in particular. Peru is making a strong push to become a very relevant nation from a supply chain perspective in LATAM. We look at Chile with a medical marijuana program. But let's be very real about this. From a perspective of a brand new industry, a nascent industry, as so many of us like to call it, can you have a plant-based economy based on an export-only status? And if so, what are you exporting? And why I say that is because let's look at the U.S.-Mexican border all the way down to the tip of Patagonia. It's very conservative, very Catholic. Drugs are not perceived as something that should be regulated and commercialized the way perhaps we see it as Americans, or certainly the people in this room who participate in this industry see it. So you have this mindset which prevents, at least for the time being, a consumer marketplace in LATAM. So it's going to be a supply location. Is that sustainable? Can you be a export-only country in a brand new environment with no standards? And by the way, throw another monkey wrench into it. What's hemp and what's marijuana? If you got a country like Colombia that says hemp is 1% THC, and the US is 0.3%, and Europe is 2.2%, and the plant comes from the 1% material, is that still non-psychoactive hemp for purposes of global commerce? Or is that all of a sudden marijuana because the source of it was above the 0.3 threshold in the jurisdiction in which the oil was going to be used?
And you look at the regulators who can't tell the difference between those two, right?
There's no way to tell the difference. So at the end of the day, what are these challenges in terms of how it be? But it goes back to the question: can you be an export-only environment economy in this environment?
My favorite lawyer answer: yes and no. I look at Asia. I mean, Asia has I think the data out there, it's about a 2% consumption rate. And most of the data analytics say Asia is the biggest cannabis marketplace out there. It's like #1 in size. But yet they're a non-consuming population. They're culturally, they are so far down. So if you have a business model, a business idea to operate in Asia, it's not a patient-based, it's not a client-based, it's not a consumer-based business plan. So it has to go back to some sort of export economy. It is, China still being one of the biggest, if not the biggest, hemp producers. And CBD is illegal for the Chinese population. So where is all of that going? It's got to be an export base.
All right, so then we've sort of gone south, and let's go across the ocean here. And we're looking at Africa as a continent. And when you look at it as a continent, it's an easy thing to do because it's such a large landmass. But there's so many countries in Africa that are adopting programs. Similarly, for export only, a lot of tobacco companies that work across the African continent are getting into the outdoor cultivation of cannabis. And unlike the Latin American market, these African nations are able to issue licenses very quickly. Because if you'd like to do business with me and I'm the king or the queen or the prime minister or whatever the role or the title might be, I can get you a piece of paper that says, go do this. Just cut me in on it. And I don't mean that in a conspiracy and government corruption kind of way. I mean in terms of the speed to actually getting permission from a government to put something in the ground. So they don't have the logjam that the Latin American nations have had with their democratic licensing process. Does that mean that Latin America becomes less competitive? Because you have African nations similarly with probably very little semblance of or a possibility of a commercial marketplace. Is it export only again? Is it another continent, frankly, vying for the supply chain dominance at a low cost into what? The EU and the United States? There's a lot of consumers, but are there that many?
How do you see that supply chain impacting the state of California when this truly is where it's headed, this global commodity? There's free market, there's import, export. We have those barriers reduced. How does a state like California or a country like Canada compete with a continent like Africa or South America, Central America? How do you see that?
That requires clear guidelines for importing and exporting product. And we don't really have that, frankly, in the United States right now, even with CBD products, which come from a legal product, even though CBD is not technically actually regulated by the FDA yet. It's difficult to export that. It's difficult to export plant material when unequivocally industrial hemp plant material is no longer a federally controlled substance, so it should be easy. The point is there's no standards that make importing and exporting these materials easy. Even with hemp across the United States, if I grow hemp in one state, and their testing protocol shows that it's homogenized, meaning I test the entire plant for the 0.3% and average it versus just testing the flower for the 0.3%. You could see one scenario being more favorable to people that want to grow higher potency materials than others. Those lack of standards for transport, logistics, take that on the global scale, import, export, are what's stopping a lot of countries from actually being able to participate. The Pro-Colombia entity, which is the export agency for Colombia, we've done some work for them. They don't have the slightest clue how to allow for exports. So you're going to have a whole country of material that can't go anywhere because they don't have an export standard in place. We're working on that. They're fixing it. But should it be a standard that is like cannabis-only standard or a standard that mirrors coffee and flowers, for example? I think it's the latter. I think you always use existing regulations when you can on a global scale because commerce already is done that way. Is that a solution that you see works, or do you see these different countries wanting to enact their own rules and reinvent the wheel every time a new thing comes out of a cannabis plant?
It's kind of what we've seen in the States. Like every state, to some degree, does shop around at what other states have done and gone before, but at the end of the day, they do their own program based on their own culture. So I've seen that more so now, but again, at least what we do for clients is try to be that forward-looking. Like, where is this headed? What's coming up? And how do you navigate that? How do you figure out, like you were describing, is it 2%? Is it 3%? What is that standard, and how's that? Is it GMP? That's great that you can export, but is the importation, does it match up? What you're exporting, does it match where you're trying to land? I also want to note, we've got a hard stop to catch our flight, but please interrupt us anytime. If you got questions, would rather hear and talk about what you are interested in versus we can just sit up here and talk all day long. So please feel free to interrupt us.
We're going to do this on the plane too, so for those.
Bob, you always say that the real market in hemp is not but it's the rest of the plant or the stock for industrial or other building products and so forth. Does that factor into your concerns or how you talk to these governments about how to shape their regulations?
So the question says, he says, Bob, you always talk about how you should look at hemp beyond cannabinoids, basically. Does that shape how the international market is evolving? It does. If you have a single-purpose plant, you're growing a Christmas tree, horticultural style, just for CBD extraction, and you can do nothing else with that plant, what kind of farmer are you? You didn't use what was available to you. You didn't use the plant genetics that were available to you. So a plant-based economy would dictate that you would use every part of that plant. You would grow a certified variety that would give the farmer the most insurance possible, including federally backed insurance, that what they was going to produce had certain germination rates, certain plant content in terms of cannabinoids, and certain usability based on international standards. Certified seed is the wave of the future with industrial hemp for that purpose. I want seeds in every damn hemp plant planted on earth. You want the seeds. You want seeds in your plant so that you can use the seeds for protein. Immediately, your company breaks even, if not makes a profit, just on seeds alone if you grow the right hemp. Then you have the fiber. That is another little profit margin. Then you have the cellulose, the heliolose, the lignin, the sugars from the plant. That's the building blocks for plastics and fuel. Commodity distribution channels exist for these things right now. Then, and only then, should you think about cannabinoids. Cannabinoids might make you a boatload of money one day. The next day, they might make you a little bit. But if you're not focused on using the whole plant and thinking about how an economic system works, then you're selling yourself short. You're not doing a service to your investors, and you're trying to participate in one industry when the plant can service at least 4 to 5. So that is the global cannabis economy that I think exists around this plant. And think about this, one last point. You grow 1 acre of industrial hemp, you get 8 to 12 metric tons of biomass. Out of 8 to 12 metric tons of biomass, 0.3% of that is THC. That's a boatload of THC, ladies and gentlemen, in 1 acre of hemp. So don't tell me that the hemp doesn't have enough THC, especially when I'm growing 1,000 acres of it. That is the basis for a global commoditization of the plant. That doesn't respect genetics, that doesn't respect researchers, that doesn't expect people that like products in a distilled state from a naturally occurring plant composition. But there's room for all of it. And if you're looking at a supply chain, that's the answer, I'm afraid to say.
But are the regulations recognizing that?
Certainly, because if you plant material that's certified, that's been legal for longer than the United States has had a hemp program in place by a long shot, by tenfold, you plant that plant material, there are distinct sectors for you to participate in right now on all of those materials. The cannabinoid industry is the new one. So you use existing distribution channels. When people say, I built a brand new processing facility, I say, let me see it. Let me see your harvester. Let me see your seed conditioning equipment. Let me see your decortication. And they go, well, no, I built a lab. Just an extraction lab? That's what you call processing? What are you going to do with the rest of the plant? What are you going to do when that unit of oil that may have cost $6,000 last week and today is $3,200 is worth $180 when the retailers dictate that the product on the shelves be $9.99 a bottle, not $69.99 a bottle? You don't control the cost of this commodity. So you have to invest in a program that's a plant-based economy that services the entire plant and uses it for what Mother Nature, Father Nature, God, whatever you want to say, put the plant here for. I've been running my mouth, Charles.
No, please, that's good.
Yes, sir.
So my understanding is that industrial hemp in Europe, it's a different market where they take tons of industrial hemp and then they extract a little bit of the CBD from it, but they have so many tons of it that they get a lot of CBD. So are you saying that that is the model here for California or North America is to grow industrial hemp at tons per acre and then use the whole plant industrially and then just process, get a bunch of the CBD from the tons rather than the pounds of hemp?
Yes, sir. Well said. So use the entire plant. especially in California where it's not even legal to produce a CBD product from the plant material you grow in the state. So why would you grow a plant for CBD primarily and only and solely when you can use it for all these other things? So the Europeans, on a scale, and by the way, the U.S. has the largest registered acres in the entire world for industrial hemp this year. We didn't plant 511,000 acres, but we registered them. We planted probably closer to 300,000 acres, which is an enormous accomplishment in less than 4 years of U.S.-based agricultural production. We do things big and bad here in the United States, especially when it comes to industrial agricultural production. So that's the model. It's an agricultural commodity. It already is. We're just adding cannabinoids into it. So why would we act like the entire industry is a craft industry? If you're a beer drinker, there's Budweiser too, everybody. They're not making their products the same way that you're making a Lagunitas IPA, for example. It's not the same material. The one's not better than the other, but one is big scale commerce and ag, and that's the present and the future. And if you don't come around to it, especially with these seed suits, you see these seed suits? The great Matt Kumin in the front filed one of them against Hemp Logic. Feminized seed, alleged feminized seed, at $2 to $5 per seed. That's not feminized, that's not certified, that's really marijuana. Charging millions of dollars for those hemp genetics? Who does that? These companies are going to pay. The USDA is going to require certified seed. It's the only way out of the woods to keep this in line. But that's the answer. Use the entire plant. And it exists right now. And why wouldn't you do that as a businessman? Why wouldn't you go in with a harvester and create 5 piles? 1 pile of herd after I've already taken out the cellulose, the heliolose, the lignin, and the sugar. After that, the herd can be used for building materials and pallets and other things of that nature. I got my fiber. If it's long, it's textiles. If it's short, that's industrial uses, door paneling for automobile manufacturers all over the world. My third pile is my keef. You guys know what keef is? That's all I need is my keef. I sell my keef to the lab. I don't make a lab without the keef producer, because that means I have to be vertically integrated. And vertical integration is a silly falsehood that was imposed on this industry because it made it more efficient. It made it more trackable by the government. So Charles, once again, I find myself talking and talking and talking.
This is the hemp expert, so if you have any hemp questions, you want to ask it right here and right now. This is free advice you're getting. Has anybody seen, I constantly get asked, you mentioned this is a global commodity, and really looking at what we're talking about from a commodity. And I at the last time I was speaking in the EU, they were talking, they did the whole demonstration with have you guys seen this, like the barrel of oil? They talk about what we're really all involved here. A barrel of oil is trading for, I don't know, 50, 60 bucks for a barrel of crude oil. A 50-gallon barrel of gasoline is like $76. Wheat, that same barrel, $1,200 or something, I think, is what it goes for. And you keep working your way up through all these commodities. Corn is like 20 bucks a barrel, 30 bucks a barrel. And then you get to, what would a barrel of solid gold, they actually wheeled out a barrel, painted yellow. A barrel of solid gold, 50-gallon drum, is $7.6 million. A barrel of high-grade, high-potency THC oil, any idea? It's like $7.8 million. It's like the same as gold. But we're not even there yet. Now you get to high-grade, medicinal, CBD, hemp-produced. Any idea what that 50-gallon drum is? And believe me, I'm not vouching for their math, but this demonstration was really important. It's like $17 million for that barrel of hemp-produced CBD, high-grade, medicinal. It's crazy. And that's the industry that we find ourselves in. That's the industry the rest of the world is trying to figure out how to get involved in. All these countries, and Bob, he guides like 30 different countries right now in their programs. But the rest of the world sees that. They want in this marketplace because this is the consumer marketplace. But they're also trying to figure out how to navigate the entire thing you're all trying to figure out. And it's just fascinating to be a part of it. Yes, sir.
Well, to change the topic, my question is more about limited licensing versus free market. And you just brought up that you've got 30 countries. We see what's happening in Florida, where certain companies take on a corporate philosophy to create moats, not bridges, as D'Angelo says, in regards to having others participate in trade. Limited licensing inherently creates barriers to
It's a very good question. So I'm a big believer that there needs to be barriers to entry, or else you're going to have the fiasco that is the current Colombian registration system right now, where you have people that have a year plus waited for licensure because there was no barrier to entry. Now, while it was very fair and very open, it allowed small farmers, people that were perhaps disenfranchised, maybe even people that wanted to clean up their act from former narco activities to come in and do things above board. But it created a logjam in licensing. So how can you create barriers to entry that are equitable? Is it an amount of capital to proceed? Is it reputation? Is it letters of recommendation? Things like this. That all can be gamed. The answer to your question is, it depends who my client is, to be honest with you. And I mean that. If a client of mine comes to me and says, I have access to the Prime Minister of Bahrain, but we want you to craft something that is a little bit more restrictive, that favors a narrow number of licensees, then that's my job. To them, I'm not working for the government, I'm not doing anything inappropriate with the government, but if I'm working for the government, I give them options. What I do is kind of like a choose your own adventure. Remember, it's a choose your own adventure book as a kid. You ask them, do you want to be more like, you paint a spectrum, Uruguay, where it was legalized and they produce it themselves, or do you want to be more like a decriminalized only marketplace, or somewhere in between? They have no idea how to answer that question. Of course they don't know how to answer that question. So you lead them through a series of questions that lead them to a customized regulatory model. That customized regulatory model is one they would have never come up with if they figured it out on their own, but you lead them to the water because you understand what they want to accomplish. And that's typically how we've structured those systems. And it varies country by country based on sensibilities. Sometimes the government wants there to be only 5 licensees. Sometimes our client wants there only to be 2 licensees, it and its other company. But it really depends by who's pushing the objective and what the market is. For export only right now, you want a limited number of licensees. Otherwise, you're setting people up to fail, unfortunately. You do need social equity programs in jurisdictions that have traditionally had disparity in the laws and the treatment around this from a social justice perspective. And you can engineer those, much like some of our state governments have, without just having an open policy or without having barriers to entry. So it's a long, long, long way of saying it varies by the country and the specific political needs, because every single country wants to legalize marijuana or hemp or whatever for a different reason. Never is it the same reason. Never, ever, ever, ever is it the same reason. So
Yeah.
One last real quick question related to that. If I'm a cultivator in Florida and I say, Bob, I need you to help me go to the legislature and enact laws that will keep California weed out of Florida now that the federal government has legalized and the state law only allows us to sell Florida cannabis, what do you say?
well, the first thing we would need to do is find a good friend of mine who's a lobbyist in Florida and work that back channel to figure out how we make those communications properly through the right channels in that particular state. Because even though I, for example, might be an expert on the subject matter and when put in the right position, be recognized as such and received as such, I shouldn't be the one going in and interfacing with the locals. You should use local people always, whatever jurisdiction you're in. So that's the way I would approach that scenario, and then look at data and look at how the market has been suppressed or what it could potentially be, and appeal to the policymakers' side of consumer protection and economic growth, but using it through the right channels. And if that didn't work, find who's the John Morgan, right? Find John Morgan and ride his coattails.
I would just add to that on the cultural side. I think when you really are on the international scene, that culture is so important. You see it in our little, the multi-state operators here. You know, every particular state has its own politics, its own culture base, its own idea of how this should go. It's even more so on the global scale. You have countries, you know, I spent a lot of time focused on the Asian market, and you have a very conservative perspective on this. So a lot of these countries are legalizing, but has nothing to do with consumption. They do not want their own population consuming. They just want to produce and send it somewhere else. And you look at some of these, how that's changing, and you see, frankly, the negative influence that our country has had over the last several decades with our war on drugs. And that has been sold to a lot of these other countries. You still have a country like Singapore now that is starting to open up. They're starting to look at this and study it. But you know what a pound of weed gets you in Singapore right now? A death sentence. It's an eligible death sentence for a pound of weed. So again, we see things, how fast it's changing here and how much, you know, sometimes we can feel like we're so far behind. But there's still a lot of countries out there that are still struggling culturally with getting away with, hey, we're going to kill people. As bad as our incarceration problem is, at least we're not killing people for that. Anyway, yes, sir.
As somebody who thinks that the hemp industry is going to be like one of the biggest industries in the world within the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think is the smartest way to start investing into hemp?
I look at building out infrastructure. When you have such enormous growth, literally, of the number of acres that are being planted, build out infrastructure. And stay away from the perception that it's just a CBD industry or that labs mean infrastructure. Labs are important, but the Western United States is full with capabilities for extraction. Eastern United States, that's where you might invest in extraction. In the Western United States, I would look at large swaths of farmland, Central Valley and California in particular, and look at ways to bring agricultural-based, full-service processing solutions to the table. There's money to be made in it. There's farmers to be partnered with it. There's farmers that have lost soy contracts, have lost chickpea contracts, that have lost hemp contracts in the northern part of the United States from a deal that went bad in South Korea through Canada, that are looking for people to work with. So that's where I would look, and if you can get in that game, that's quite a profitable endeavor. The other end to be in is if you don't want to touch the plant, or if you're not right an ag guy, you might go, I didn't get into cannabis to be an agricultural guy. Because it's true, there's a distinction between agriculture and horticulture. If you're not that, then look on the branding side, the branding and marketing side. Can you create a retail product? Can you effectuate proper distribution for someone else's product? Distribution would be a big, big solution to the main problem right now for industrial hemp production. And this is primarily what we do at GPS and at the law firm most days, is find buyers for people for distribution. So we work with distributors in Europe, and we were able to get our clients CBD products in over 12,500 stores across Europe because of those distributor relationships. So look at distribution opportunities across the U.S. for retail products, be aggressive, and look at a company like ehemp.com, ehemp, for all your hemp needs.
Hey, I would add to that too. It's getting harder and harder to make it in this industry. It's not easy, and it's going to get even harder. It's becoming a far more legitimized, focused on revenues, focused on traditional business skills. So the days, I look back, my first cannabis client 10 years ago, those days just don't exist anymore. Now you got a legal team and accountants and tax lawyers and professionals building your strategy, and HR departments. It is a full-on sophisticated industry at this point. So I would just add to that, like, where do you get in? It's make sure you invest up front on what that's going to look like, what that business plan is, and can you actually get from where you're starting to producing those revenues? Because if you can't, and if you haven't thought that way to do there, you're not going to succeed in this. Your competition is getting better and better every day that goes by.
This gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm Hoban from Colombia, actually. I think I'm the only Colombian around here in this venue.
Did you come here just for this?
Yeah.
Awesome.
The thing is, like, we are developing a company, actually, from the States to develop some operations in Colombia, right? In Colombia, we don't have the know-how to produce cannabis as we do here in California, right? So we are bringing people from the States to develop our operations over there, right? Besides the amount of money that you need to grow weed over there, it's very low cost weed, right? The country needs social impact. The country needs very things around. That's why some people, and as you mentioned, Charles, Colombians are just willing to receive money easy and fast, right? That's their mindset. That's their cultural mindset. We want to change this. We want to bring money to the country to get those investments, to help farmers to know how to grow weed, to know how to develop their own weed, right? So we are the ones who are doing it. I believe you found like a disaster over there. People are just like having money and land. Oh, there is a chance for bringing Canadians here to receive like millions of dollars easy, right away, just 1 month deal, right? Why not this type of people? So let me know what can we do for this? Because Colombia is now like a hub of cannabis. I know it, and you guys you must know it. It's not because of the low cost production. It's also because of the environment. We are located in
First of all, I use Colombia as an example because I travel there quite a bit. I love your country, and I'm invested in a number of people and helping them succeed, and so it's a very timely question. I use it as an example because it's a country that jumped in from a policy perspective so quickly. They made mistakes, but not because it was Colombia, just because nobody knew what they were doing, and no country knows what they're doing. So you try to get them at the right place at the right time. The problem has been the focus on, yes, oh, a company's going to come in and buy my license for $12 million. I spent $50,000 to get my license. That's a good living. Anybody get a return like that, I'll take it. The second thing, though, is, oh, I'm going to start cultivating. I can register my seeds. That's wonderful. But then what about processing? To the person that doesn't understand processing in a marijuana plant or a hemp plant, you think that you can just roll a piece of processing extraction equipment off of a truck and make it work. It doesn't work that way. But people don't understand that what they don't understand, what they don't know. So it's forgivable, but there are lessons for companies, and the market's unfortunately going to teach them a hard way who the winners are, who the losers are, and it'll get down to a market-based number of operators. So it's just about being patient, realizing that there's no quick buck, and that if you're going to participate in this industry, that you have to view it as being built to last, because the eyes of the world are upon us. And if you don't do it right, you're going to fail. And you don't want to fail on a big stage with everybody watching.
We got about 3 minutes left. I think we wrap up at, so we'll take a couple more questions and then, yes, sir.
Last week there was a conference in Jamaica, Montego Bay, West Indies. I attended the one previous year, and I was surprised at the presence of Canada in Jamaica. At that convention a year ago, Jamaica shipped its first legal container of cannabis oil to Canada. And my question for you is, what have you heard, or what's your opinion of the exchange between California and Jamaica? Because I have been personally asked to see if I could facilitate that, and I'm glad you're here.
Well, I'm
glad I'm here.
I'm glad you're here. I was in Jamaica at Doug's event. Doug Gordon, a great friend and client of our law firms, who puts on the Jamaica Cannex, which is a great event, and it attracts a lot of people from all over the world. I was there a couple weeks ago. They're still trying to figure out the regulatory system right now. Still trying to figure out what they're going to be. What's the allure of Jamaica? It's the ganja, man. It's the flower, right? And the genetics historically. But can you be a participant in a global economy, shipping flour around the world? You know, what's the economy of shipping flour material versus shipping oil, et cetera? So,
I mean, the value is kind of obvious.
So I don't expect you're going to see U.S. imports of anything high THC, but you will. This is all right. It's time. But you
And
will.
we're
see,
done.
You will see plant material coming out of Jamaica, but is that sustainable when you don't produce oil? And that's really what the marketplace is going to demand. If I can grow flour, why wouldn't I just get the genetics and grow it in my backyard, not literal backyard, my region, to produce it commercially versus shipping it over the seas? They got to sort those things out. But the government's working hard on it. We met the officials, and we're working with St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They're trying to have the same program. There's a lot of good stuff happening there. It's just, you don't know what you don't know. Are you a flower producer? How do you participate in the global economy if you don't know what the product you're going to ship out yet is? Because you don't know what the market demands yet. But there were a lot of Canadians there.
We're going to
You
wrap
always tell
this.
by the hockey shirts.
We're going to wrap this up. We so appreciate you on your Friday afternoon in San Francisco, sitting here listening to these two guys talk. So I hope you're heading to the bar now to dinner. Please email us if you got questions. Like you can see, Bob will talk about this all day long, literally. So email him with questions for anything like that. Thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you, guys. Even though no one's listening.